like I said, there was one death after another. I mean, people were just being shot and killed and dying. There were labor leaders and people I haven't even mentioned yet. Medgar Evers, three of the civil rights workers were found murdered by basically a Klan death squad, and the rest. And there was so much people, they were starting to get tired of. I'm tired of turning the whole idea of turning the cheek. I want to start shooting back.
When do you think the violence aspect really came into play for the left? Because you always heard about that with the right. These far-right extremist groups were always a little violent. But it wasn't attached to the left like it is now. The left used to be the proponent of free speech. They used to encourage debate. You had the ACLU say that, Nazi groups should be allowed to march.
Yeah, they were not. They lost a lot of favor with the left even back then.
Yeah, but that was an important fight.
It was.
And they acknowledged at the time that you have to let groups you disagree with speak, or you lose the right to speak. We've lost that today.
Yeah.
Now it's you have to say the right speech, or you don't get the right to speak.
Well, the ACLU actually are still proud of that position. They still fundraise, and they lost a lot of support over that position on the left even then. You could argue that the left was actually even more violent at that time. What happened in Chicago, and yes, I primarily blame the Chicago cops and the Mayor Daley machine. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to see the trial of the Chicago 7 yet.
No, I don't know what happened in Chicago.
Oh, okay. Well, Chicago was the Chicago Democratic Convention, and different groups were coming there to protest because LBJ was going to be there and to protest the war. And because it was a Democratic president that was leading the war, and Chicago's a place to organize. Well, Mayor Daley, who was a Democrat but very kind of conservative in a lot of ways, said no demonstrations, would not grant and permits for any demonstrations, would not grant, and was saying, you show up, we're going to arrest you. Well, tens of thousands of young people showed up anyway, and they showed up with the cops, and it was a bloodbath. And so the next year, the Nixon became president, and Mitchell, if you study, you'll hear about him. He ended up in jail over Watergate, but he was the attorney general. Wanted federal charges filed against 8 of the organizers. It was down to 7 once Bobby Seale was separated from the trial. He shouldn't have been part of it anyway because he really wasn't in it. But as they point out in the movie, they wanted a scary black guy in there to scare the jury. He was one of the Black Panthers, and that's the other thing, is that was the Black Panthers and other groups represented a kind of a violent break from the Martin Luther King crowd. I mean, there was a lot going on back then, so there were violent advocates of the left and the Weathermen, and we'll talk about that. But what was happening in Chicago was they weren't necessarily advocating that it turned violent, but they said, we're going to come here. Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, the Jerry Rubin are all very famous organizers of the time of the left, and they came from very different parts of the left. But they were all organizing their groups and coming there. And so when this horrible thing happened, luckily nobody was killed. A lot of people really badly injured, a lot of officers and everything just poured all over Chicago. Just the streets.
Was it violence amongst the protesters or against the police?
Between the police and the protesters, and also some counter demonstrators and the protesters, but it was mostly the police and the kids that were protesting got so angry that some of them actually got into the one of the halls of the convention, Democratic convention, and it was just chaos. I mean, it was absolute chaos. But the police were not great. Anytime they showed up for a group in the park, to do what should have been a lawful protest, police were all over them with batons, breaking heads open. I mean, it was really bad. This was where Buckley was not at his best, and he was in a debate with Gore Vidal, and you can find this on YouTube too, where Buckley is like saying, "Well, I believe that the police actions were justified," and Gore Vidal says, "Well, I expect you to say that because you're basically a crypto Nazi," and then Buckley says, "You say that again, I'll sock you, and you'll blah blah blah," and there it just kind of broke down. This was not a good time, and then. And then Buckley threatened to sue and everything, and all this became. And then Gore Vidal's apology wasn't really an apology. He said, "Oh, yeah, that just kind of came out of my mouth. I only meant to say crypto-fascist." Just so anyway, it was just. I mean, this was the time. This was so. Well, we think it's bad now, but it was at the time, and there were a lot of people who were saying, "Look, every time we try to have a peaceful demonstration or a peaceful anything, our leaders get killed. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all these people, and we get beaten up, and and the rest." So they started to become violent. The Weathermen actually organized an underground group. They were small, but they started blowing up bombs. They always warned people. They never killed anybody, except accidentally 3 of their own when a bomb went off in a house. But they would always give like a half-hour warning and say everybody better leave that building because but it was violent.
And they were actually putting bombs out there. They're just
they were blowing up buildings, and the like, and Hoover got pissed and could never catch up with them.
So maybe I'm wrong then. Is it more violent now, or is
I don't
it just
think it
a
is.
different
I think
form?
what you see is more spontaneous violence, but I don't think you'd see the organized violence like you used to. I mean, that was back then. You had the Symbionese Liberation Army. I mean, people were actually advocating a violent overthrow of the system.
Well, you have Antifa now that basically,
Yeah.
I mean, thankfully, they're not as organized
Yeah,
as other groups, but they
punch a Nazi kind of.
Yeah, but their whole thing is we need to burn society down so we can build it back up more equitably.
Some of them say that. Others just say we need to punch Nazis and scare them back out of the place. But yeah, and there was that element too then of that, and that's not healthy. And some of it is just a street reaction when you have young black men killed. It's not anything new. Going all the way back to Watts and the others, you tend to have riots. This is what happens. It's not like and when Martin Luther King, a lot of the people who back the violence will quote him as saying a riot is the voice of the unheard. He wasn't trying to justify it. He was talking cause and effect. He said, when you do this and they're not unheard, this happens, right? He was not in any way. He was an advocate of nonviolence, but he was trying to explain to American leadership, this is what happens when you kill people and there is no justice from it.
Well, you had Chris Cuomo on CNN say, "Show me where it says protests have to be peaceful" on live national news, saying that.
Yeah. I mean,
how crazy is that?
It's inflammatory, except that I don't think very many people in Antifa are listening to Cuomo. But still,
but just to say that on national news on a network like CNN, which at the time you could make the argument it was more respectable,
and it's a pandering, obviously. To people.
That's all they do now.
Yeah, right.
And the same can be said for Fox News.
Sure. It was, and to a certain crowd and the rest, and there's a lot of anger out there. I don't think it's actually more violent now, though. I think it's actually less violent. I think you got this element and the rest, and you do have ideology justifying it, but it was a little more scary back then. I was a little bit young. I came in on the tail end of it. I was 4 years old when King was shot, and I didn't know much about what was happening with the Weathermen. I was in grade school at the time, but I did know about the SLA. That was the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. You may have heard of that a little bit. That was the Hearst daughter, the newspaper magnate, and she actually...
Randolph Hearst.
Yeah, Randolph Hearst. It was his
William
granddaughter.
Randolph Hearst,
his granddaughter was captured. She suffered from Stockholm syndrome. Actually participated in bank robbery, and was and then they were all, a bunch of them were killed by the LAPD. Set the house on fire and shot them as they were leaving. It's really a horrific situation. But they were called the Symbionese Liberation Army. I don't even remember what Symbionese means. But it was, you had a lot of this going on back then.
So do you think that this violence is just an effect of people feeling oppressed, whether it's warranted or not, and it just takes that form?
I think the spontaneous riots happen that way. I think that those are when people go out there and start.
But what about these movements where, especially on college campuses, where
I think it starts that way. I think it's a cynicism that gets born of things not changing fast enough for them, and back then, like I said, there was one death after another. I mean, people were just being shot and killed and dying. There were labor leaders and people I haven't even mentioned yet. Medgar Evers, three of the civil rights workers were found murdered by basically a Klan death squad, and the rest. And there was so much people, they were starting to get tired of. I'm tired of turning the whole idea of turning the cheek. I want to start shooting back, and it was just and when you're young, especially, and a little bit, maybe not quite as patient and not realizing how slow change really is, how agonizingly slow it can be. Yeah,
That's a big part.
Yeah,
That wanting to turn the ship faster than it's turning.
Then it's turning.